There is entirely too much to talk about here for a film adaptation that is 2 hours and 16 minutes of sheer hollowness. But I do fear that Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights and the discourse around it sheds a lot of light on the state of our society and our continued backslide to fascism, white supremacy, and a general trend towards anti-intellectualism. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Jenny, and this is my channel, This Story Ain't Over, where I primarily discuss books, journaling, writing, publishing, and every now and then provide my hot takes and opinions on pop culture and online discourse, including my thoughts on some book-to-movie adaptations. Now, as soon as I saw the discourse around the casting and the trailer for Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights, I knew I probably wasn't going to love it as an adaptation. And yes, I am the dreaded English major that every fan of this film hates to see coming, but I am also a history major who likes to take a historical perspective on things, and I personally love the original book by Emily Brontë. This is my original copy that I read from when I was around 15 years old, and I have since reread it twice, including my most recent reread right after seeing the film at an early screening on February 4th. Since then, I've done a series of short-form videos, which you may have seen, but there's only so much nuance and content I can cover in a 3-minute video. So today, I'm going to be going in depth into talking about both the book and the movie with spoilers, and I've helpfully chaptered the video if you want to skip forward to some other parts, but I recommend watching this from beginning to end to get the full sense of my argument. I will review this film as its own thing to start, simply to humor the fans of this film who think we should separate it, divorce it from the original work. Even though it's an adaptation in quotation marks, that's something you can't do. It is never going to be divorced from the source material. But I will do it just to show you how this film was pretty terrible even on its own. From the outset of its poster announcement to the trailers and all of its marketing, this film was supposed to be a romantic, R-rated, erotic, sadomasochistic rendering of the book. And honestly, I can get behind that because there are hints of that in the novel. We'll get back to this. But what this film fails to do is actually deliver on any of those promises.
Do you want to know how I know that Wuthering Heights was a flop and that Jacob Elordi and Margo Robbie have absolutely no on-screen chemistry together? One does not need to check the reviews. One does not need to check Letterboxd. There are absolutely zero fan edits on my timeline.
Beyond the lack of chemistry between them, the way that the eroticism and even the sex scenes were dealt with were just so terribly unsexy and unserious that it's truly a wonder to me that people found this titillating rather than juvenile and infantilizing. Obviously, there are some campy elements to the film, but I think that the biggest disservice that the film does to itself is to not actually commit to the bit. It doesn't go the distance. It tries to be erotic and sexy, but also satirical and funny. It tries to be campy and surreal and absolutely unserious. And rather than any of these items complementing each other, they end up clashing instead. Overall, the film is incredibly moist.
The whole film has a feel of moisture throughout it. So this is like posh moisture, and it drips down from the panels onto the floor on occasions.
You're wet. I am not!
And the build-up towards the sex is always presented with this like ooey grossness that is both shocking and weird, but not something that would really turn you on. We have Kathy shoving her finger into the mouth of a dead fish suspended in aspic. We have the dough kneading on the table. We have all of these sweaty backs and snails and constant rain, and no one ever remembers a freaking umbrella. And all of these images are meant to evoke the idea of sex. But the weird thing is that even when we do get to the sex, it's kind of one note and boring. And for an R-rated film, that seems really odd. Like it didn't want to commit to the actual eroticism, the kink, the bodice ripper that it promised to be. And maybe it's not a problem of the film, maybe it's a problem of marketing, but I think this ties back to a lot of the criticisms of Emerald Fennell's works, that she simply goes for hollow shock value. But I do think in Saltburn at least, which I actually quite enjoyed, though I haven't seen it in a while, so I think if I rewatched it, I may feel differently, but I did feel like some of the more sexual, shocking scenes of that film did make more sense with the main character that we had. Whereas with this film, it felt like some sort of pantomime or cosplay at adult desire and sexuality. And I think this is also why people were so enraged about the casting, not just about race, but about age. After we finish with the child actors and move on to Margo Robbie and Jacob Elordi, it's mentioned that Kathy is a spinster, to somehow explain the fact that Margo and Jacob are too old for the roles. But to do that and then reinforce that these are grown adults and then still have them acting like children or teenagers truly contributed to the overall immaturity and unsexiness of the film. When Jacob catches Margo Robbie masturbating behind the rock, she literally runs away screaming. And not only that, he lifts her up by the bodice like she's a child. And I know people find that sexy, but it was so infantilizing. Margo is continuously childish throughout the film, and it becomes so unbelievable because she's just too old to be acting this way. And I also think it's what contributed to a lot of people feeling like they were watching Margo Robbie and Jacob Elordi on screen rather than Cathy and Heathcliff. Compounded with the fact that there were all these montages set to the Charli XCX songs, which the songs were great. The album was great. I loved it. The visuals were stunning. But none of that is enough for a film to be good. What makes a great film is the story. The visuals, the music, those are all mediums used to tell a story. But the main point is the story, which was just simply not there. I brought up something in my short form review that this film had this sort of insular dollhouse feeling, much like the actual dollhouse that Isabella has in the film. And I had someone comment that they felt like it was a representation of Cathy feeling trapped at Thrushcross Grange in her marriage and in the expectations of society. And while I can see that point, I do disagree. When you think of a dollhouse, you don't immediately think of a cage. And you certainly aren't thinking of Charli XCX singing Chains of Love in the most obvious, soundtrack moment over a montage of Margo Robbie looking sad in her big house with all of her beautiful clothes, as if Edgar, the brown man in this film, is somehow keeping her against her will, when he is in fact building shrines to her skin, her white skin. Again, I will get back to this. When you think of a dollhouse, you think of something miniature in parts, but large overall. It's a child's toy, but also a sandbox to play in and dream in. But a dollhouse is also an immature, imagined reality, a plastic rendering of a house and of the people in it, and it intrinsically disregards the world outside it. And that is perhaps the best metaphor for what this film is. The irony being that they were sending dollhouse PR boxes to influencers for the marketing of this film. Now, it's interesting because the dollhouse is Isabella's, who is the high-class person in the film. She's a rich woman who is presented to us as weird, socially inept, needy.
He is the most handsome man I ever saw.
And an obsessive character who passionately recounts the plot of Romeo and Juliet and who collects Cathy's hairs to make a doll out of them, which of course she then brutalizes because she feels Cathy has wronged her, hoping to somehow punish Cathy in the way of a child by stealing her things and breaking them. Now, this is not even to mention that we learn that Isabella has a BDSM dog kink, where she seemingly enjoys the way that Heathcliff chains her up like a dog after they get married. But she is somehow also paradoxically unaware of the sexual innuendos she makes towards Cathy prior to that. We get that moment where she gifts Cathy this scrapbook that has a vulva and a penis in it, and she somehow doesn't seem to see that, but Cathy is kind of appalled and shocked. And in this way, Isabella is made to be both extremely naive, but also a willing, consenting participant to Heathcliff's abuses. And while this is most certainly a masquerade of some kind of girl power, I'm not oppressed, I chose this narrative, rather than adding any real depth to her character, it only serves to absolve Heathcliff of any real blame for his actions. If our Jacob Elordi Heathcliff was actually a rapist and abuser with someone who does not consent, then we'd be hurting the poor modern sensibilities of 2026 viewers who need to view Jacob as the romantic bad boy. I mentioned this in my short form review about how I felt that Isabella's character in the film could be read as a pseudo self-insert of Emerald herself. And a lot of people commented and said that, they felt Cathy was her self-insert. And I disagree with that for some key points. Beyond the class and wealth parallels to Isabella, if we also factor in the way that Emerald keeps calling this film what her 14-year-old self thought the book was when she read it, and that her 14-year-old self was, in her words, a slut.
What did 14-year-old Emerald make of the book?
Well, 14-year-old Emerald is sort of similar to 40-year-old Emerald, which is that she's
little slut.
And if we also factor in the way that she built shrines for Margo Robbie and Jacob Elordi with pieces of their hair to put in their dressing rooms, you can kind of see where I'm coming from. And I think the key difference between Kathy and Isabella is that at the end of the film, Kathy dies, and we don't actually know what happens to Isabella. For all intents and purposes, within the context of this film, she gets to go on having BDSM sex with Jacob Elordi even after he cries over Kathy's corpse. And I mean, if this is your definition of feminism, then I don't want it. So basically up to this point, I've given you my review of the film on its own with great effort not to compare it too deeply to the book. One of the numerous arguments I've seen in favor of the film is that had it been called something completely different, it wouldn't be getting the criticism that it is. And I absolutely agree. But a lot of these takes don't acknowledge that the reason for naming it Wuthering Heights, even in quotations, isn't so much a deep attachment to the source material. I think, even if Emerald Fennell says that she's read the book so many times and loves it so much, I do think it is just the fear of or lack of ability to commit to a original story. And the knowledge that Hollywood as it is right now is becoming more and more incapable of making successes out of original stories, and instead relies on existing IP to carry the weight of poor screenplays. I mean, if this film had been called Kathy and Heathcliff, or even just Kathy, it would have made more sense. But I think Emerald Fennell knew, and Warner Brothers knew, and Margo Robbie's production company knew that if they called it Kathy, it would not bring in the amount of audience that it has. They couldn't use all of the angles that they've used for the marketing. And I do think that that is one of the major reasons for calling it Wuthering Heights, because these days people who go to watch movies are very unwilling to watch original works. Part of the reason that we are in this age of countless recycled adaptations, whether it's Wuthering Heights or Pride and Prejudice, and these endless sequels and prequels and the constant nostalgia reboots and remakes and revisits to IP that are younger than this century, is because people are unwilling to invest time and energy and thought into a new original story. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about the film in relation to the book as an adaptation and also the book itself. Let's start with the details of its author and publication. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights was published in December 1847 under the male pseudonym Ellis Bell, and it appeared as the first 2 volumes of a 3-volume set. The 3rd volume was actually a completely different novel, Agnes Grey, which was written by Emily's sister Anne, who was writing as Acton Bell. So Wuthering Heights had been published after the relative success of Jane Eyre 2 months before. Jane Eyre is quite famous. It's by their oldest sister, Charlotte Brontë, who was writing as Currer Bell. Now, interestingly, contemporary reviewers didn't know what to make of Wuthering Heights. The Athenaeum called it a disagreeable story. The Atlas called it a strange and inartistic story, with a general effect that is inexpressibly painful. Wuthering Heights casts a gloom over the mind, not easily to be dispelled. It does not soften, it harasses, it extenterates. Extenterate means to take out the entrails of, to eviscerate, disembowel. Similarly, the Examiner calls it a strange book. It is not without evidences of considerable power, but as a whole, it is wild, confused, disjointed, and improbable. Now, if you're someone who picked up the book after, watching the film, or because of the film, you've never read Victorian literature before, if you've never read Gothic literature before, you may have been pretty appalled by the book and thought very similarly to some of these contemporary reviews. If people can agree on anything, Wuthering Heights is a difficult book. It is a difficult story. It is by no means a Jane Austen novel, and it's not even, Frankenstein. It is a very domestic novel full of horrible characters doing horrible things. Now, unfortunately, Emily never did see her work published under her real name, because on December 19th, 1848, just 1 year after its publication, Emily died of tuberculosis at the young age of 30. Many people have been saying that Emily Brontë died of tuberculosis, and yet still this film was the worst thing to happen to her, and I must agree. The book was eventually published under her real name 12 years later in 1850, and it was revised by her sister sister Charlotte, who happened to survive both her sisters. Now, Charlotte decided to add a editor's preface in which she attempted to defend the book against its original critics. And in that defense, Charlotte attempted to portray her sister as some sort of untutored genius, a native and nursling of the moors, who should not be censured for violating the rules of decorum about which she was unaware. Now, Charlotte did this despite the fact that Emily was by no means a country bumpkin. Emily was indeed educated and had even traveled as far as Brussels with Charlotte, where they were offered a broad course of instruction, including French and German, arithmetic, geography, history, and scripture. Charlotte even wrote in a letter from Brussels that Emily works like a horse, and that Emily was generally unhappy with the nature of their learning rather than by the difficulty of it. By following the rote French exercises assigned by Constantine Hager, Emily suspected that, quote, they should lose all originality of thought and expression. This is a very curious observation, given that if Wuthering Heights did anything, it challenged its readers with its originality. Now, despite all of the negative contemporary reviews, there were other reviews that were more positive. One review said, "We strongly recommend all our readers who love novelty to get this story, for we can promise them that they have never have read anything like it before. It is very puzzling and very interesting. We must leave it to our readers to decide what sort of book it is." Now, is it a romance or is it a romance? Here, I would like to make the argument that all the hot takes online about how this book isn't a love story, that it isn't a romance, isn't quite the hot take that they think it is. Yes, Wuthering Heights isn't a romance in our contemporary sense of the word, especially as it regards to genre conventions. Romance as a genre in literature today in 2026 is commonly expected to have something called an HEA, or a happily ever after, which, as we know, is not the case with this book. Though you could argue that since in the book their corpses end up side by side in death, is that not a happy ending? Wuthering Heights is still at least partially a love story, and there's no real arguing around that. Yes, it's a toxic love story in our contemporary sense of things, with characters who are extremely flawed, selfish, and cruel. This isn't your biblical love, where love is patient and love is kind, but it is love. And to say otherwise is a fairly moralistic view of love. There's so much concern over the romanticization of a toxic romance or love story and how people may view this as a normal idea of love. But despite this being quite clearly not a normal romance or a moralistically good love story, if we are truly scared about people misinterpreting it, then we should be more concerned about their media literacy, in my opinion. The problem isn't so much the content here as it is the way our society is perceiving it. Emily Brontë so very astutely portrays a love that is not redeeming, that is not kind, that is enduring even beyond death. But she also pokes fun at the drama of it all, at the theatrics, and this is mainly through the perspective of Nelly and her narration. We as a reader are put in Nelly's position to know not to take everything at face value that's happening, but we are also Lockwood listening to Nelly and knowing not to take everything Nelly says at face value. Wuthering Heights is not a romance, but it is a romance with a capital R. So what is Romanticism? Romanticism is an attitude or intellectual orientation that characterized works of literature, art, music, etc., from the late 18th century to the mid-19th century. And it was a direct reaction or opposition to the period of the 18th century where there was this focus on classicism and enlightenment, on rationalism and physical materialism. Romanticism, in contrast, emphasized the individual, the subjective and the irrational, the imaginative and the personal, the spontaneous and the emotional, the visionary, and the transcendental. It also included a deepened appreciation for the beauties of nature, a general exaltation of emotion over reason, and a preoccupation with the genius or the hero, and a focus on his or her passions and inner strengths. It also had a predilection for the exotic, the remote, the mysterious, the weird, the occult, the monstrous, the diseased, and even the satanic. And Wuthering Heights comes a bit after the formal end of the Romantic period, and it is most often simply referred to as a Victorian-era novel, but it's certainly Romantic-inspired. We see the nature elements with the setting, but also with how Cathy describes her love. My love for Lytton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. One scholar writes that these oppositions to which Heathcliff and Edgar correspond include the aesthetic categories of the sublime and the beautiful, the generic forms of the Gothic and domestic, and the literary historical forms of Romantic and Victorian. Though some scholars argue that Wuthering Heights counterpoints a masculine romantic ideology with a feminine one, dramatizing but also departing from the ideologies of desire that characterize the work of the major male romantic poets, against the narcissistic structures of desire or theogonies of the self readable in high romantic works, mostly by men, in which the female other acts as the mirror image of the male poetic self, supporting a myth of transcendence and egotistical sublime. Emily Brontë instead propounds a feminized romanticism that affirms the values of continuity, community, and generation. In the introduction to the Oxford World Classics edition, John Bugg argues that Emily Brontë also took great inspiration, especially in terms of the ethical complexities of Heathcliff's character, from one of her own favorite works, John Milton's Paradise Lost. Many romantic writers such as William Blake and Mary Shelley, Percy B. Shelley, and Lord Byron were fascinated by Milton's depiction of the charms of evil in his characterization of Satan, and it spawned its own virtual genre known as Romantic Satanism. John Bugg writes that Romantic Satanism is characterized by an interest in both the abstract idea of evil's allure and more often the risks of writing about characters who project dark charisma. This is obviously one of the inspirations for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, another Gothic work that Jacob Elordi also stars in the most recent adaptation of. In Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster, or the creature, is tortured by alienation and physical and psychological abuse, that he becomes a monster in actions to match his appearance. But Milton, Shelley, and Brontë all knew exactly what they were doing with their characters, by balancing their abhorrent behavior with a justifying narrative, forcing us as readers to sit with the discomfort and figure out what we think ourselves. What's interesting is that Heathcliff's character directly engages with this idea, the idea of him being the hero of a romance in Volume 1, Chapter 14. He says to Nelly when she visits Wuthering Heights that Isabella gave up her wealthy comforts, quote, under delusion, picturing me a hero in a romance and expecting unlimited indulgences from my chivalrous devotion. He goes on later to say, she cannot accuse me of showing a bit of deceitful softness. The first thing she saw me do on coming out of the Grange was to hang up her little dog. So from this quote, we can see that Heathcliff knows that Isabella is romanticizing him, that she is thinking of him as the hero of this romance. And in order to deliberately reject the idea of him being the hero of this romance, this chivalrous man, he quite literally hangs her dog on the side of the fence. And not only that, I think this was a gesture by Emily Brontë to also signal to the reader that they should not think of Heathcliff as this romantic hero, as this chivalrous person. This moment in the novel is actually one of the first moments where Heathcliff actually commits a heinous, abusive act, all in the sake of proving that he is not this person. And so what's further fascinating about this 2026 Wuthering Heights is that Emerald Fennell read all of that and went, nah, I'm gonna romanticize Heathcliff anyway. I'm gonna put Jacob Elordi in the role, and I'm gonna have everyone salivate over this softened version of Heathcliff that is palatable to the masses. So Emerald Fennell has spoken to the fact that the genesis of this adaptation and the whole BDSM dog kink scene overall started with Isabella and was based on this very scene that I was talking about where Nelly goes to visit Heathcliff and Isabella and he reveals that he hung up Isabella's dog. Let's watch the clip.
Was there a moment in the novel that unlocked the tone of the entire film for you?
Such a good question. I think there's a moment in the novel which is a very kind of disturbing part of the film, which is when Nelly goes back to visit Isabella and Heathcliff. And then he says, no brutality disgusts her. I believe that she has an innate admiration of it. And to write that nearly 200 years ago, that is the most transgressive, troubling, explicit thing. And for me, there's always that undertone, that kind of sadomasochistic undertone in all the beauty that Cathy and Heathcliff have, this love that is just sucks and obliterates everything around it, the good and bad. And that was the thing for me, I think, when I first read it, where I kind of gasped. I was like, whoa, she's getting at something really difficult. So that, I think that was the moment for me.
I truly cannot express how off base this reading is that she has of the novel in this scene. And it actually just outs her as having a complete lack of critical thinking, or simply wanting to ignore that. Because while she's calling this, the most transgressive part of the novel, she's completely sidestepping the fact that this is dialogue said by Heathcliff, who may not be, may I just say, the most honest or reliable source of information. I mean, we are just told that he is a dog-murdering, revenge-seeking, abusive man. And to top it off, on the very next page, Isabella literally says to Nelly, "Don't put faith in a single word he speaks. He's a lying fiend, a monster, and not a human being." So to take at face value what Heathcliff, Isabella's abuser, says over her own words and call it transgressive that he said she was into it, like, what even is going on? Because it's giving every sexual assault or rape trial we've ever seen, where the rapist will say that the survivor wanted it, that she consented to it. Meanwhile, the survivor will be saying the exact opposite, and no one will believe her. And this is what I mean by consensual rape feminism, in the sense that, like, it's this reframing of the domestic abuse and rape as if she was in control and she wanted it, but it completely ignores the source material in that way and sort of disrespects the source material in that way, because it's deeply insulting of what Isabella goes through in the novel and also what she represents in the novel. Isabella's character is so interesting because she is the one person who manages to escape Heathcliff. John Bugg writes in the introduction to the Oxford World Classics edition, Isabella's break is a radical act, as she leaves despite the dearth of options that await her. When he says dearth of options, he means, like, there's so little options that she has. She's leaving her husband and her income, and she's going off on her own, and she's also leaving with a child, and so we don't know how she lives. And he continues, we learn little of Isabella's life in the subsequent years. A narrative elision that Judith E. Pike suggests shows that Brontë neither wishes to condemn her escape by portraying her straitened possibilities, nor weave a fantasy resolution. We might consider here Rachel Blau Duplessis's observation that in many 19th century novels, the main outcomes possible for female characters are either absorption in marriage or death. Wuthering Heights offers a particularly violent version of this narrative foreclosure, but it is significant that in the case of Isabella, Brontë allows some space between marriage and death. For a dozen years, Isabella is allowed to live away from Heathcliff in the south near London, raising her son in what we may suppose is, at least measured against the home she has left, relative peace. All this to say, I think it's very telling that Isabella's character and this moment with the dog getting hanged was a moment that Emerald Fennell wanted to fixate on and create this whole adaptation out of. It signals a gross misinterpretation of the novel and of the characters, but also this sort of girly popification of this layered text in a form of feminism that is not really as progressive as she thinks it is. And I think she is so obsessed with the idea of shocking people that what she produces in terms of art just ends up being so hollow. Now, despite all of this, there are indeed sadomasochistic elements to the book, and there's scholarship around it. But they are most prominent in Cathy and Heathcliff's relationship and in Cathy and Edgar's relationship. In To Save the Life of the Novel, Sadomasochism and Representation in Wuthering Heights, Robin DeRosa argues the following. There is no doubt that Catherine is a sadist through most of their young relationship. Although she was hardly 6 when her father left for the fateful trip to Liverpool, she chose a whip as the gift she most wanted him to bring back to her. The whip is, of course, lost in transit, and Heathcliff is produced instead. Catherine, when she learnt the master had lost her whip in attending the stranger, pleasure, showed her humor by grinning and spitting at the stupid little thing. What we see here is Catherine's whip has, in fact, not been lost. She's had it all along, somewhere inside of her. Although this is the first peek we get at both children, it seems plausible that Catherine has not been sadistic up until this point. She relies on Heathcliff's masochism as much as he relies on her sadism. As Catherine gets closer to her death, she becomes increasingly less sadistic and increasingly more masochistic. Simultaneously, Heathcliff becomes more and more sadistic. As two sides to the same metaphorical soul, Catherine and Heathcliff can move easily across the S and M separating slash. When the moment of her death is upon Catherine, though, there is a little sadism left in her. Heathcliff holds her in an embrace from which Nelly thought her mistress would never be released alive. "That is not my Heathcliff," she goes on about her murderer. "I shall love mine yet, and take him with me, he's in my soul." After Catherine dies, Heathcliff quickly shifts again to masochist to set himself up for the death which he so longs for. Establishing Catherine as his tormentor, accusing her of haunting him still, Heathcliff dashes his head against the knotted trunk of a tree. Nelly notices that both he and the tree are covered in blood, and she surmises that he's been repeating the self-destructive acts throughout the night. "Drive me mad," he wails to his dead love, "only do not leave me in this abyss, where I cannot find you. Oh God, it is unutterable." In his openness to masochism, Heathcliff sinks into an abyss, a space where language fails him as it did when he was a young child, and when he was a young man in love with his torturer. Funnily enough, the whole scene about wanting to kill Edgar, I feel like originates from this line from Kathy. She goes as far to say, "I have such faith in Linton's love that I believe I might kill him, and he wouldn't wish to retaliate." The complexity of the sadomasochism is so fascinating in the book, but in the film, it's generally turned into this fairly boring 50 Shades of Grey sadistic dom male and masochistic submissive woman. Kathy wanting to have her corset tightened to hurt herself on bare skin, mind you, which is absolutely historically inaccurate. Typically, you would have had a chemise underneath the corset, and a lot of people have pointed out the historically inaccurate outfits and stuff like that, but I will get back to that in a second. And although Kathy is cruel in the film as well, I do feel like her cruelty is mostly directed towards the other women in the film, namely Isabella and Nelly. Her physical and verbal abuse is never really towards Heathcliff, except when they're small children and she yells at him for not being able to read. And honestly, in my opinion, Margo Robbie had more sexual chemistry with Hong Chow and Alison Oliver than she really did with Jacob Elordi. And then, of course, the severity of each person's cruel attitude and actions are softened so much that the film starts to feel pretty vanilla. And I start to wonder, what was the point of focusing on this element, this sadomasochistic element of the book, if it was just to give us the one BDSM scene with the servants and a dog kink scene for shock value? Neither moment really reflects on the main love story, nor adds to the eroticism of their relationship. Moving on to the Gothic, this is perhaps the biggest missed opportunity of the film for me, especially given the way that Emerald Fennell was clearly able to deliver on a grave scene in Saltburn, but somehow not for the adaptation of a book with a literal grave scene. But let me start off by explaining what the Gothic is and its genre conventions. The Gothic novel gets its name from the Gothic style of medieval buildings and ruins, and many Gothic novels feature settings like castles, like in Dracula, or monasteries. Gothic novels have a prevailing atmosphere of mystery and terror, and the ones of classic horror, like Frankenstein, Dracula, introduce the existential nature of humankind as a definitive mystery and terror. Wuthering Heights employs the Gothic with several other genre tropes. We have a large eldritch house dating back several generations, an ambiguously presented hero-villain, a fascination with death and corpses, along with the very boundary between life and death, suggestions of the supernatural, and extremes of landscape and weather that are matched by extremes of social experience, like imprisonment and flight. Along with this, we can include the multi-framed narrative structure. Lockwood getting the story from Nelly, who also gets parts from Isabella's letter, then later from Isabella herself in the flesh, and at one point even from Zillah. And it all serves to introduce a level of epistemological uncertainty, much like the way we have the frame narratives in Frankenstein, which also involves a series of letters that are telling the story and placing the reader a bit removed from the actual story. What was particularly wild to me about this film was that the main taglines, which have been commercialized and immortalized on every possible item, are quotes from the book that are taken wildly out of context and detached from their Gothic leanings, instead made to be more of the erotic, romantic variety. Drive me mad, take any form, be with me always, come undone, kiss me again. These words are actually uttered by Heathcliff after he bludgeons his head against a tree trunk, drawing blood all night, knowing that Cathy has died. After Nelly confirms that Cathy has died, he says the following words: I pray one prayer, I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you, haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers. I believe, I know, that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always. Take any form. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. O God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. And Nelly goes on to say, probably the scene I witnessed was a repetition of others acted during the night. It hardly moved my compassion. It appalled me. Still, I felt reluctant to quit him so. But the moment he recollected himself enough to notice me watching, he thundered a command for me to go, and I obeyed. He was beyond my skill to quiet or console. I think beyond all of the criticisms that people have had about this film, I think it just simply didn't deal with a lot of the more interesting aspects of the book. This is the man who stands over Catherine's corpse and finds her locket where she has Edgar's hair in it, and he takes it out and throws it to the floor and puts his own hair in that locket. Heathcliff is also the guy that when Edgar dies, he has Catherine's grave dug up so that he can blow out the side panel of her coffin so that when he dies and he's placed next to her and he blows out the side of his coffin, the two of them can lay next to each other in death. I mean, this is the man who quite literally begs her ghost to haunt him and then actually has her ghost coming and haunting Wuthering Heights. There's even this part at the end of the novel where Nelly is telling Lockwood about how the people in the town have said that they've seen Catherine and Heathcliff's ghosts wandering about, and she tries to explain it away, but the hint is there. And I think it's just so crazy to me that this depiction of love that transcends death was not represented in this film, even though it's meant to be a romantic film. I would say the most romantic parts are actually the Gothic parts of this novel, but they aren't even mentioned. Like, there were so many source-accurate ways to portray this consuming love and still pay homage to the Gothic, and instead, nothing but Jacob Elordi crying softly over her limp body is actually included in the film. Now, one of the more annoying parts of this adaptation, to me at least, is the way that they combined Mr. Earnshaw with Cathy's brother in the book, Hindley, because it fundamentally undermines the politics of Heathcliff as the usurper, not only in the racial sense, but also in terms of the family, in terms of class, in terms of property. Earnshaw in the book is a generally kind man who brings Heathcliff home after a trip to Liverpool and soon treats Heathcliff as his favorite among his children, including, Cathy and Nelly. There are a lot of theories about this whole situation, which I will get back to in a later section of this video, but focusing on Hindley for a second, Hindley in particular resents his father's love for Heathcliff. And Nelly too is jealous at first, but she soon warms to Heathcliff because unlike Cathy and Hindley, he is not intentionally cruel for the sake of it, at least not at that young age. Emerald Fennell does talk about the reason why she cut out Hindley, and here's the clip.
I noticed that Hindley is absent from the story, which really shapes the whole novel. So can you talk to me about your choice of that?
Yeah, and Hindley in many ways, I feel, has always acted like a kind of... He's much more of a narrative tool in a funny way than he is. He's one of the only characters that I feel that Brontë doesn't really extend any grace to. And therefore, I always find that quite difficult when you're looking at making a kind of drama.
So we see that she calls him more of a narrative tool and that he's one of the only characters that Brontë doesn't extend any grace to. And I have to say, this is just plain wrong. Yes, Hindley is awful even as a child towards Heathcliff, but it's mainly because he's jealous of Heathcliff. And he only becomes truly awful, I think, when his wife Frances dies and he's left with his son Hareton. And then also he's left with Heathcliff, whom both both his father loved and his wife did not even like. Hindley in his grief descends into alcoholism and a gambling addiction, which Heathcliff further encourages when he comes back into their life. And all this is ultimately stuff that, Hindley struggles with until he dies. But the whole point about him not being given any grace, I think, doesn't account for probably one of the most tragic details of the book, which is that Cathy Sr. dies before Hindley. And for her funeral, he wants to try and make it there, but he's overcome by his addiction once again. Now, there have been biographical readings of the novel that argue Hindley may be based off of Emily's real-life older brother, Branwell, who died in September 1848, just 3 months before she did, after a long battle with alcoholism and addiction. In her 1971 biography of Emily Brontë, author Winifred Gérin quotes a letter Charlotte Brontë wrote after her brother's death. Charlotte writes, "Had his sins been scarlet in their dye, I believe now they are white as wool. He is at rest, and that comforts us all." Gérin goes on to argue that while Charlotte hoped that Branwell would be absolved of his sins in death, she suspects that, quote, Emily derived no consolation from this idea, and instead, quote, Emily suffered for his suffering and saw in his death only the destructive power of love. She was aware that people who die for love need not be admirable people. Hindley, like many of the other characters, dies of a broken heart, really. And while that doesn't absolve him of his sins, it also doesn't mean that the two things can exist at the same time. And I think this novel, if anything, is about the complexity of enduring love and how even love can make monsters of us. But then for the film to have dropped his character and combined it with Earnshaw's seems to really flatten the story further. And it also turns this interesting and complex dynamic into a rather conventional abusive alcoholic father situation in Hollywood. The scene where Margo and Jacob find Earnshaw dead with the green bottles stacked perfectly in these pyramids was just so absurd and honestly stupid because it really drew the attention away from the narrative. We instead get Earnshaw's funeral as another outfit op for Margo, and honestly that funeral scene, I just don't see that it added anything to the film, except for furthering this sort of infidelity plot. There's not much complexity in the emotions that Cathy and Heathcliff have for Earnshaw in the film, aside from that scene where she kind of kicks his corpse, but even that just felt more like a funny gimmick rather than any real interrogation of her emotions. Another aspect to this whole conflation of Earnshaw and Hindley in the film is that rather than the situation where in the book where Hindley feels like Heathcliff is a usurper and taking his place, and so he directs his abuse towards Heathcliff, in the film we get both Heathcliff and Cathy suffering under Earnshaw's abuse, and they sort of trauma bond because of that. But I think that also detracts from, like I said, the sadomasochistic elements of the novel, where Cathy is very much this sadistic character from the get-go. And I think it adds this complexity to their relationship as well that is sort of missing in the film. It also removed a lot of the intense hate that Heathcliff harbors and the revenge that he wants to take. I mean, most of Heathcliff's revenge in the novel is directed towards Hindley, not really towards Cathy, partially towards Edgar, but mainly towards Hindley, who he quite literally usurps from his, property, from his life. He drives him into this gambling addiction and into death, and he goes so far as to turn Hareton into a proxy of himself, to take revenge on the next generation of Hindley's line in the same way that Hindley treated him. But in the film, despite, conflating Earnshaw and Hindley, we don't really see Heathcliff actually harbor that much hate towards Earnshaw. Honestly, I feel like Heathcliff's character and Jacob in turn just felt so apathetic in the film, like he didn't have that much of a presence in relation to any of the characters except for Margo. Throughout the novel and most of the second half of the book, Heathcliff is trying to secure the property of the two estates, Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, as a form of revenge, to strip his enemies of their power, but also put himself above them, to elevate himself in status, and also disrupt the natural lineage flow of inheritance. In Volume 2, Chapter 6, Heathcliff says to Nelly, "My son is prospective owner of your place, and I should not wish him to die till I was certain of being his successor. Besides, he's mine, and I want the triumph of seeing my descendant fairly lord lord of their estates, my child hiring their children to till their father's land for wages. That is the sole consideration which can make me endure the whelp. I've engaged a tutor also to come 3 times a week from 20 miles distance to teach him what he pleases to learn. I've ordered Hareton to obey him, and in fact, I've arranged everything with a view to preserve the superior and the gentleman in him above his associates. I do regret, however, that he so little deserves the trouble. If I wished any blessing in the world, it was to find him a worthy object of pride, and I'm bitterly disappointed with the whey-faced, whining wretch. As that quote shows you, Heathcliff can barely stand his own son, but he's most interested in being able to take his revenge and put himself above Hindley and steal all of their property so that he can be in the master position. He essentially wants to usurp the class dynamics. One of the most striking images or motifs of the novel is the carving atop the front door of Wuthering Heights, which Lockwood clocks immediately. It says Hareton Earnshaw 1500, and the first thing our Hareton learns to read is his own name above the door. And I think this is significant because by the end of the novel, Hareton is restored to being the rightful owner of the estate, just as his ancestor Hareton owned and perhaps established the estate in the 1500s. This is important and we'll get back to it. But let's move on to race and imperialism, which brings me to why Heathcliff wants revenge in the first place and why it's so important to him that he take from everyone what he did not have. First off, as we know, Heathcliff is not white. There's plenty of scholarship around this. There are plenty of clues in the text itself beyond the very blatant descriptors that quite literally call Heathcliff a dark-skinned man on page 3 by Lockwood. And of course, we also have the various slurs that are flung at him throughout the novel. Heathcliff is called a gypsy at many points, which could refer to a Romani person, but the word, as Deborah Nord demonstrates in her scholarship, was a fairly elastic descriptor in 19th century Britain. She writes, if English literature of the 19th century contains within it a constant, ubiquitous marker of otherness, of non-Englishness, of foreignness, it is the gypsy. A figure of literary origins and anthropological interest, the gypsy could signify social marginality, nomadism, alienation, and lawlessness. But Emily Brontë doesn't just stop there. She also has the characters describe Heathcliff as a lascar, meaning a sailor from India or Southeast Asia. He's described as an American or Spanish castaway. But most importantly, we are told in the text that Mr. Earnshaw picks up Heathcliff in Liverpool, and that part of the novel is set in the 1770s. And Liverpool at the time was the largest slave trading port in Britain. I think perhaps one of the worst takes I've seen online about this is how all of us are giving too much credit to some white chick from the 1800s for having a thoughtful commentary about race, which is something I think has more to say about the people today than it has anything to say about Emily Brontë. Because with just a little research on the internet, you would know that Emily Brontë has a lot of context and reason for maybe wanting to do this commentary. I think it's ridiculously reductive to say that white people in the 1800s had no concept of race, or that they were all just racists, period, because it quite literally ignores the history of how we got here in the first place. Race is a concept that was constructed through colonialism, but it was also something that Victorians were deeply aware of and anxious about because of British imperialism. At this point in the empire, we are getting the line, the sun never sets on the British Empire. The Brontes in particular were very aware of this. Emily's father, Patrick Brontë, was a curate and was, quote, involved in a number of cultural and political initiatives, including the abolition of slavery in the British Caribbean, Catholic emancipation, and reform of the criminal code. Emily Brontë quite literally grew up with someone in her household having an abolitionist point of view. And while that doesn't mean that she or her family weren't racist at all, it does mean that they had a complex view of race. Another thing we need to consider is just the history going on at this time. In August 1833, Parliament passed an act for the abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies. Enslaved people who were over the age of 6 became apprentice laborers, and they were to work without compensation for the period of the apprenticeship as a transition to freedom. They were still tied to their estates, but they could buy their freedom even against the will of their employer or their master, and the act also set out some rights. Formerly enslaved people could not be removed from a colony, families could not be separated, and employers were to supply food, clothing, clothing, lodging, and medicine. The period of apprenticeship ended in 1838, after which full emancipation was granted to all throughout the British colonies. Now, according to scholarly evidence, Emily Brontë first composed Wuthering Heights between January 1845 and May 1847, between the ages of 27 and 29, which gives us at least a good 7 years at least after emancipation, at which time Emily would have been 20 years old. Now, if we combine this with the fact that Emily Brontë deliberately sets the novel first in 1801, when Lockwood is writing his part of the narrative, and when we get to Nelly's narration, we flash back another 30-ish years, which sets us squarely in around 1770. Now, what city was active as the largest slave trading port in Britain? Liverpool. Where was Heathcliff picked up? Liverpool. From mid-1740s, Liverpool was the largest slave trading port in Britain, overtaking Bristol. Thereafter, Liverpool's control of the industry continued to grow. So to say that Emily Brontë, who lived through the abolition of slavery in her nation, could not be smart enough or have enough depth to be purposeful in her portrayal of an ambiguous man of color during this time is just yet another, I would say, frankly, misogynistic and stupid attempt to defend the actions of a wealthy white woman in 2026 who, for all intents and purposes, is either too self-centered to notice the blatant racism of her adaptation or extremely well aware that despite her intentional choices of the white supremacist variety, our society in 2026 will easily bend over backwards to explain it all away in the name of "it's not that deep, you're reading too much into it, you people will reach for anything." And as many people in the comments of my short form content said, it's giving Sydney Sweeney, "My jeans are blue." Now, returning for a moment back to Hareton Earnshaw 1500, that carving above Wuthering Heights' front door, the 1500s is also a significant number or century to be calling back to, because it also invites a different kind of commentary. When Heathcliff dies, Joseph says, quote, "The lawful master and the ancient stock were restored to their rights." It's kind of what John Bugg calls a utopian erasure of the consequences of imperial history. A return to 1500 just before the rise of the slave trade, before the racist reaction that greeted the subsequent appearance of people of African descent in England, which led to Elizabeth I's proclaimed expulsion of late divers black Moors brought into this realm. So too does 1500 fall before the Romani people made their way to England and Scotland. Legislation for their expulsion soon followed. And before the founding of the East India Company and the arrival of Lascars in England's port communities. To return symbolically to 1500 with a Hareton Earnshaw once again in possession of the estate, that is to imagine a time before imperial ventures began to shape the nation's economy and change its demographics forever. This, Brontë knows, is no more possible in 1803 than in 1847. John Bugg goes on to argue that rather than give an answer to the consequences of the entrance of the other, like Heathcliff, Brontë instead explores the complexities of sympathy in an age of imperial expansion. And this is where I argue that Heathcliff's specific race is not so important because Emily Brontë intentionally leaves it quite ambiguous. Because Heathcliff's status as a racialized other who arrives as a usurper within this small community is quite literally the driving force of the novel. Now, of course, I do need to address the fact that there's a lot of speculation and also real scholarship around the idea that Heathcliff is probably Earnshaw's illegitimate child. In Nelly Dean's narrative, no reason is suggested for Earnshaw's visit to Liverpool, and this is said in a passage where Nelly describes not only the distance, 60 miles each way, and the fact that he's going to make the journey on foot, but also the gifts, the fiddle, and a whip to be purchased for Hindley and Cathy. These details are presented clearly, but Nelly never so much as indicates why Earnshaw is making this arduous trip, whether in connection with the farm, legal matters, or personal reasons. Mrs. Earnshaw considers her husband to be mad, and the narrator, Tart, Nelly Dean, expresses doubts through her manner of recounting the tale. She informs Lockwood that Earnshaw tried to explain the matter, but he was really half dead with fatigue. All that I could make out was a tale of his seeing it being Heathcliff. The brief picture of Mrs. Earnshaw presented here would certainly supply an added motive for concealment of a child who could possibly be Earnshaw's illegitimate offspring. She was ready to fling it out of doors, she grumbles, and berates the exhausted innocent traveler. How would such a woman have reacted to any honest admission of sinful adultery? Earnshaw could only bring a byblow into the family by devious means, as long as his wife was still alive. In addition, Heathcliff soon becomes Earnshaw's favorite, more cherished than his own children. An unnatural occurrence, surely, unless this is a natural child. Nelly has her suspicions. Earnshaw, she comments, took to the child strangely. This poor fatherless child, as he called him. Hindley, for his part, sees Heathcliff as a usurper of his parents' affections. Overall, I think this also further explains Hindley's jealousy over Heathcliff, and also a potential moralistic argument you could say that the novel is pushing, that Heathcliff and Cathy could not be together except in death because they are siblings or half-siblings. It's essentially a cautionary tale. Cathy's line, "I am Heathcliff," takes on a whole new meaning because she is literally half his blood. Now, this doesn't negate the fact that Heathcliff is not white. In this reading, I think it's even more likely for Earnshaw to have slept with, or most likely raped, an enslaved woman, and later learned she died, so decided to collect the child in Liverpool. Which brings me to one of the central questions of the novel, which is Heathcliff really the villain, or is it everyone else? Consider how each character treats Heathcliff, oscillating between calling him a monster and a human, between hating him and loving him. Cathy says she is Heathcliff in a way that kind of erases who he is, and the very real societal differences they have. Meanwhile, Hindley and Joseph are pretty continuously racist towards him, as are the Lintons. Isabella is infatuated with him, but as a dark hero. Meanwhile, Nelly, complex Nelly, who is perhaps the closest stand-in for the reader's own sympathies with Heathcliff, genuinely cares for him, and at several points helps him and cares for him, but is forced to contend with the absolute brutality of what he's become as a result of the oppression he's faced. It's also curious then that the second generation, Cathy Jr. and Hareton, are the kindest to Heathcliff from the outset. And I think the novel also hints at the fact that this is because Nelly has had a direct hand in each of their upbringings. Nelly nurses Hareton as a baby and a toddler, and she raises Cathy Jr. in Catherine's place. Neither child ever really hates Heathcliff for being different, only for his cruel actions. Cathy Jr. has a speech in Volume 2, Chapter 15 that goes, "Mr. Heathcliff, you're a cruel man, but you're not a fiend, and you won't from mere malice destroy irrevocably all my happiness. I've given over crying, but I'm going to kneel here at your knee, and I'll not get up, and I'll not take my eyes from your face till you look back at me. No, don't turn away. Do look. You'll see nothing to provoke you. I don't hate you. I'm not angry that you struck me. Have you never loved anybody in all your life, uncle?" Now, this speech was done after Heathcliff strikes her and is, trying to instill some fear into her so that she does what he says, and as he tells her that he won't let her see her father before he dies. And I think what's key here is that even after Heathcliff has abused her, she still believes in the goodness in him. She doesn't hate him out of any kind of prejudiced malice. She has a sense that he's doing this out of revenge, but at this moment in time, she doesn't hate him for it. And I think it's really important because she only learns to hate him afterwards. And when we take this in comparison to Linton Heathcliff, raised by Isabella in the company of the rest of society, when he learns he'll be meeting his father, he immediately asks, "And what is my father like? Is he as young and handsome as Uncle?" Uncle being Edgar. Nelly specifically doesn't answer with any mentions of Heathcliff's skin, and instead mentions his black hair and eyes. Linton then responds, "Black hair and eyes? I can't fancy him. Then I am not like him, am I?" This is probably one of the most tragic moments in the novel, at least to me, because Linton is Heathcliff's own son, but he has learned a level of prejudice against him because of his appearance, and he automatically assumes that he cannot fancy his father, that he cannot love his father because he is not like him. And I think this moment is so indicative of showing us how Emily Brontë has purposefully crafted this narrative to show that Heathcliff's racial difference is a major part of the prejudice that he faces. And again, with Cathy Jr. and Hareton, we have to also remember that they have lived within this insular community of the Yorkshire Moors, and Nelly has been their pseudo-parent. They've been maybe taught by a curate, but for the most part, they have not learned to hate people of other races. And so the idea of Heathcliff being a racialized other is very very strong. Another thing I think we need to consider is that the idea of degradation is so interesting in the novel as well, because before Heathcliff truly commits most of his heinous acts, mostly in volume 2, the other characters have already done some very terrible things. Hindley quite literally throws his own son, Hareton, over the banister. Cathy gets angry at the toddler and starts shaking him when she's, having this moment with Edgar, and she ends up hitting Edgar for trying to stop her. Before that, she also pinches and slaps Nelly, and Nelly even pinches and torments Heathcliff when he first arrives at Wuthering Heights. But she gets no reaction out of him because he's already used to abuse even before he arrives. And this, I think, lends more to the theory that he must have been an enslaved person. I also think it's interesting that basically all the main characters have a reason for being awful except for Cathy Sr. And, I've already gone through the sadomasochistic elements and how Cathy is very sadistic even as a child. But I think this also gives meaning to Cathy's line, "That is not my Heathcliff." She says this before she dies, when he's being sort of rough and mean and abusive towards her, more sadistic than he was before. But also in just the way he has become unrecognizable to her because of his desire for vengeance. Cathy insists that the real Heathcliff lives within her and she's taking him with her. But I think it also speaks to her loving this version of a racialized person who just takes the abuse with grace and never fights back, rather than the racialized person who demands his space and his due. Most of their childhood, Heathcliff takes the unspeakable abuse from Hindley without a word. And although we're told that Earnshaw is upset by it because he loves Heathcliff, we're never once told that Cathy stands up for him or even really cares that he's getting abused, which I think is another huge departure that this film made from the book. And I think, it's partly to do with how could you love a Cathy like that, who is so awful? I mean, she's awful in the film and she's meant to be unlikable, but she is so awful in the book. And I think what's obvious here is that Heathcliff cannot degrade Cathy any more than she has already degraded herself. This applies to Hindley as well. Interestingly, the one person who loves Heathcliff unequivocally is Hareton, the most innocent and unprejudiced of them all, but also someone who Heathcliff has tried to put all of his vengeful anger onto. In Volume 2, Chapter 19, Hareton said he wouldn't suffer a word to be uttered to him in Heathcliff's disparagement. If he were the devil, it didn't signify. Hareton would stand by Heathcliff, and he'd rather Cathy Jr. would abuse Hareton as she used to than begin on Mr. Heathcliff. And this is after lots of abuse has already happened, but Hareton loves Heathcliff unequivocally. And I think like Frankenstein's monster, who Jacob Elordi ironically also played, Heathcliff's character in the book is not so much a reflection of a black or brown person in Bronte's time, but rather a reflection of the attitudes towards the other in Victorian sensibilities and the anxiety around British imperialism. Wuthering Heights is so many things: a toxic love story, a Gothic horror, a tale of revenge and generational trauma, but most of all, it's a portrait of the everyday bigotry and cruelty people will perpetuate and the fear of the monster that cruelty could beget. It's ultimately a story of white characters who fear the usurper when it was their status as oppressors that made him what he is. Characters like Heathcliff and Frankenstein's monster actually remind me a lot of characters like Killmonger in Ryan Coogler's Black Panther. While T'Challa can easily be a good character, a moral character, because he grew up in this untouched Africa, Killmonger is a character who grew up in the very real racist society of contemporary America. And part of what makes him and Heathcliff such compelling characters, I think, is that despite the awful things they do, you can see the twisted justice of their actions, and you can empathize with it. But with that comes the issue of having to sit with the discomfort of caring for someone so far gone and acknowledging your culpability in the society you live in.
And when I first saw him in the haircut, I realised he looked exactly like the Heathcliff on my sort of very, very well-worn copy of Wuthering Heights that I'd had since I was a teenager.
And the Heathcliff casting, has had some comments around if that should be a person of colour. And
I think the thing is everyone who loves this book has such a personal connection to it. And so you can only ever kind of make the movie that you sort of imagined yourself when you read it.
Now this is a lovely little segue into talking about the casual racism of this film. And I should clarify what I mean by casual, because I don't think Emerald or Margo and her production company or Jacob Elordi in taking this role were particularly clever, nor do I think they're completely ignorant. They are, however, what many people are these days, casual in their racism, and casual in their tolerance of racism. It's the inclination to say it's not that deep, you're reading too much into it. What did you expect? Who cares? It's the arguments that always have the word just in them. It's just a visual callback to a racist film. It's just her interpretation. It's a great movie if you just turn off your brain for a good time. From the get-go, Jacob Elordi's casting was met with huge backlash. One, because as we've established, Heathcliff is not white. Two, because although yes, many Wuthering Heights adaptations have whitewashed Heathcliff, we are in fact in the ye old year of 2026, and one would hope that if someone is doing a Wuthering Heights adaptation, they'd be considering the racial politics of the current day. And to anyone who says, oh, Emerald Fennell is a white woman and you want her to be telling the story of this racialized man, to that I say, Emily Brontë managed to tell a nuanced story in 1847. I am sure Fennell can manage in 2026. And I do believe it was possible, but the problem is that no one wants to tell this incredibly rich story. They'd rather just have a horny necrophiliac fanfic by the brain of a 14-year-old wealthy upper-class white woman where they can salivate over the pretty white faces of Jacob Elordi and Margo Robbie. With that said, let's talk about desirability and the casting of Shazad Latif as Edgar. Funnily enough, Emily Brontë at many turns still portrays Heathcliff as a desired, layered character. And there are multiple takes online about how having a white woman direct a film and cast a black or brown man as the villain is not it either, but I disagree, especially in the case of this film. Because yes, Heathcliff is awful in the book, but this film didn't actually portray him as a villain or even as a horrible person. If anything, like I've been saying, it softened him so completely so that 2026 viewers could still find him a hot, tragic hero of a love story. I mean, who the fuck inserts a consent scene into a Victorian Gothic revenge novel except to make it palatable to modern audiences as a romance? Rather than inflicting generational trauma and having a vendetta against Hindley and Edgar for their treatment of him, Heathcliff instead gets a rom-com makeover. And I guess what I'm saying is, if the intention was to soften Heathcliff from a villain or a cruel person in general into a slightly anti-hero hero, then the question of casting an actor of color, even if the film was directed by a white woman, would be essentially a moot point. And all this ties back to desirability and who gets to be desirable in Fennell's works. The colorblind casting of Shazad Latif, and I should say I only say colorblind in the sense of it being colorblind in the context of the film. His race plays no part within the framework of the film. No one acknowledges anyone's race in the film. But of course, this is not a colorblind casting in our real world because it creates an inversion of the racial politics of the novel, and we can see that as viewers. The tragedy of Heathcliff's position is in the fact that he envies Edgar not just for his class or his status, but for his physical features that make him white. Heathcliff specifically says in that scene with Nelly where he asks her to make him decent, there's no point, trying to look respectable because he'll never have Edgar's light hair, his fair skin, his even forehead, and his blue eyes. So then to cast Shazad Latif, a half Pakistani man and a visibly brown man, not as Heathcliff, but as Edgar, and take every possible precaution to make him look stuffy, unsexy, and undesirable, make it seem like he's Margot's jailer and that sex with him is a chore, or even implied as non-consensual since she's not, enthusiastically into it. And to do this even while in the book, Kathy does love him to an extent, enough to put a lock of his hair in her locket. And what else is this except a unconscious or conscious attempt to show that non-white men cannot be desirable and cannot be heroes, especially heroes of the greatest love story of all time?
I think it's quite hard when you're playing sort of the ultimate cuck man,
And the fact that we further get Edgar's character so obsessed with Margot's white skin that he literally makes a shrine to it. Like, how blatant are we getting? And I think, it just felt so very white supremacist for a lot of viewers. One thing that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about is the fact that they also refuse to make Isabella Edgar's blood sister, the way that she is in the novel. Instead, she's made into his ward. ward, which, if you didn't know, in Victorian society, wards were very often like adopted children of, lords and ladies, but very often it implied that they were their bastard child or illegitimate child. So to say that she's his ward is a bit of an odd situation, whether Fennell was trying to imply that she was Edgar's illegitimate child, though I don't think she was, because Edgar is made to be so unsexy in this film. But I do think making her his ward was to intentionally avoid the issue of needing to cast two brown people as major characters, and to preserve the Emerald Fennell self-insert, and also the fact that only white women are allowed to sleep with Jacob Elordi in this film. Let's talk about Nelly, the villain, and also the maid that did it, and how all of this is, a representation of Emerald Fennell's anxiety over the working class.
I don't think Nelly is neutral. I'd be interested to see how audiences do interpret her, because I think at the very least she may be guilty of accidental cruelty.
In the film, Nelly is changed to be the illegitimate daughter of a lord. She's portrayed as envious and spiteful rather than the maid who is simply exasperated with Kathy's nonsense. Like, she is tired. She is a working class woman who is tired of Kathy's bullshit. But Nelly in the book is also someone who can't help but feel sympathy for Heathcliff despite hating him for all of his wrongdoings. In part, her bitterness in the film takes on the weight of Hindley's hate in the book because we don't have him there. She holds this grudge over the fact that Heathcliff replaced her as Kathy's closest friend. And in the film, Nelly becomes directly responsible for the misunderstanding that drives Kathy and Heathcliff apart. She sees Heathcliff through the window and intentionally goads Kathy into admitting that it would degrade her to marry Heathcliff. In the book, the culpability is more on Heathcliff, I would say, actually, because he is there in the room before Kathy even enters. Nelly knows he's there, but he never speaks up. He never makes it known that he was there when Kathy enters the room. And even after this misunderstanding happens in the book and after Heathcliff leaves, Nelly immediately comes clean to Kathy that Heathcliff was listening. She tries to go look for him. He's not there. And then she comes back and she's like, Kathy, he was listening. That's probably why he left. And the interesting thing about this in the book is that Kathy doesn't even bat an eye to this when Nelly tells her this. Like, she's not angry at Nelly at all. She's just like, oh my God, what did I say? Because she literally can't remember all of the mean things that she said. But in the film, we have Nelly harboring this secret of how she drove them apart. And it's only years later when Heathcliff returns and, he and Kathy are having their affair that he tells Kathy. And I just have to say here, the fact that this misunderstanding is pinned on Nelly, of her being jealous of Kathy and wanting to willingly drive a stake between her and Heathcliff, like, that just felt so disingenuous. And also, like, Emerald Fennell wanted to take a stab at, the working class character in this situation. But we also have to take into account that the person that she cast for Nelly is Hong Chow, an Asian woman. So to not only make Nelly a villain as a working class character, but then to also make her the Asian working class woman villain, like, I just can't. Later in the film, when Kathy falls ill, Nelly doesn't believe she's actually sick, and she thinks she's just doing it for attention. And while that part is true in the novel as well, in the movie, Nelly also starts burning the letters from Isabella/Heathcliff and convinces Edgar that he shouldn't see Kathy for months. Months! All of this culminating in Kathy dying of sepsis. Now, I just need to say before I even compare this to the book, the fact that we're supposed to believe that Edgar, sweet, caring, loving Edgar, even though he knows that Kathy is cheating on him, the fact that he wouldn't go see his wife for months just based off the advice of his maid, like, are you for real right now? Now, in the book version of this, Nelly is nowhere near as devious or calculated as she is in the film. In volume 1, chapter 11, Kathy gets into a dramatic mood after Heathcliff and Edgar have a confrontation. And that confrontation, of course, happens because Nelly tells Edgar about Heathcliff visiting the estate, but also visiting Isabella, which is key because she's scared that Heathcliff is going to spirit Isabella away and really convince her that he's in love with her. And then we get this moment where Kathy asks Nelly to tell Edgar that she's ill so that she can frighten him. And Nelly, of course, does no such thing, but Edgar does come back to the parlor where they're, sitting and asks Kathy to renounce her friendship with Heathcliff once and for all. And he does notice that she seems ill, but Nelly tells him not to worry, and Kathy falls ill on a Monday night. And it's Thursday evening when she starts hallucinating. Kathy even remarks that it's only been that brief a time. On the Friday, Edgar does come and see her, and he is astounded when he sees Kathy and sees how sick she is. And he accuses Nelly of hiding things from him and intentionally antagonizing him against Kathy. In response to Edgar's accusation, Nelly has this line where she says, "I perform the duty of a faithful servant in telling you, and I have got a faithful servant's wages." This line I feel like is so important because it speaks to the class and wealth divide, and also just this element of like Nelly is just a working class woman. She's just a maid. Like, she is trying to do her best, but also like Kathy is just so awful and capricious and mean. And so what Nelly does in that moment in the book isn't actually all that horrible, I think, at least. Like, we sympathize with what she is going through and why she does what she does. Now, there's also context in the book where Kathy fell ill when Heathcliff left the first time, and so this is like a return of that old illness. And I think that context just makes things make more sense. Another element to this is how Nelly's character is also flattened by the fact that her relationship to Heathcliff is basically removed. Nelly is by far one of the characters that is the most sympathetic to Heathcliff's plight. Although she's not above using racist language when he first shows up, later on the only real issues that she has with him are with his heinous, vindictive actions, not with him intrinsically. And at several points in the novel, Nelly is Heathcliff's confidant. After Kathy returns from the Grange, changed more like a lady, and Heathcliff is only more rough because of the way that Hindley's been treating him, and then Kathy sees him and sort of makes fun of him for his appearance. Now, it's right after this that Nelly feels quite bad for him, and she offers to help clean him up and, make him look better for Kathy. Although he rejects her offer at first, he later comes back to her and says, "Nelly, make me decent." And so she helps him out, and she also cheers him up with the talk of imagining his origins as much loftier than they are. "And now that we've done washing and combing and sulking, tell me whether you don't think yourself rather handsome." "I'll tell you, I do. You're fit for a prince in disguise. Who knows but your father was an emperor of China, and your mother an Indian queen, each of them able to buy up with 1 week's income Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange together. And you were kidnapped by wicked sailors and brought to England. Were I in your place, I would frame high notions of my birth, and the thoughts of what I was should give me courage and dignity to support the oppressions of a little farmer." She goes on to narrate that, "So I chattered on, and Heathcliff gradually lost his frown and began to look quite pleasant." This moment is so beautiful and just so indicative of how the treatment of Heathcliff is how he becomes the monster that he is. Nelly treats him with such kindness, and she even goes as far as calling him handsome. She calls him desirable, which I think is very key here in the way that we are seeing the flip and switch with this adaptation. Throughout the novel, Nelly is a humanizing force for Heathcliff, and she is also meant to be a humanizing lens for us as we read the book. Later on, Nelly is also the one to actually ensure that Heathcliff and Kathy do get to see each other before she dies. Whereas in the movie, she burns all the letters so that he can never make it in time to see Kathy, and he only sees her after she's dead. But in the novel, although she sets up the meeting, it's rather begrudgingly, and it's because Heathcliff is kind of forcing her into it. But I do think it's significant because she does care about both his and Kathy's well-being. Although she finds both of them intolerable and absolutely exasperating, she does care about them. After Kathy dies and Nelly sees Heathcliff take Edgar's hairs out of Kathy's locket and then replace them with his own, Nelly witnesses this, and she doesn't just throw away the hairs that he put in the locket. Instead, she acknowledges his love as well as Edgar's. She takes the pieces of hairs and she entwines them together and puts them back in the locket to represent Kathy's love of both men. And again, I think this is key because she never invalidates Heathcliff's feelings, and neither does she put down the love that Edgar had for Kathy or that Kathy had for Edgar. She acknowledges the importance of all of them, and that's something that the film doesn't do. It doesn't hold space for these characters, and it just sort of simplifies everything until it feels rather one note. Now compound this with the fact that Nelly is the person who basically raises the next generation. She indoctrinates a level of compassion into Hareton and into Kathy Jr., and even tries with Linton. Now, I mentioned that scene where Linton says that he, can't fancy his father because he doesn't look like him. But just before that, Nelly actually says to him, "You must try to love him, his father, as you did your mother, and then he will love you. This quote again is just so important because if we juxtapose it with the scene, the Nelly make me decent scene where she is treating him nicely and he seems to become more pleasant and more handsome because of it, she's implicitly making the argument that Heathcliff is a monster because of the way he's been treated. And if all of them had treated him with love from the get-go, perhaps he wouldn't have been the person that he is. And she tries to indoctrinate, this level of moral code and good behavior in Linton, but of course it doesn't really work. It fails mainly because Linton's already become prejudiced in the wider world. Honestly, Nelly is perhaps my favorite character of the entire novel, aside from Heathcliff, I think. She's such an interesting and layered character who is not only a proxy for the reader and, their sympathies towards the characters, but also an incredible and kind and compassionate person throughout the novel. And yes, there's like one guy who wrote a paper about how she could be the villain, but most scholars don't actually think so. So I think you can't even make the argument that she was meant to be a villain, and that's why Emerald Fennell made her that way. And this brings me to the final boss of the racism of this film, which is the connections to Gone with the Wind, 1939.
Okay, so it really feels like this film is in conversation with film history. I got a bit of a Gone with the Wind meets Kubrick.
Well, that's truly like the nicest thing that anyone could have ever said, and that's absolutely, I've always felt that the thing about this book is it's just like timeless, it's out of time, it's like an explosion of emotion. So we were absolutely looking at Gone with the Wind.
So if you're like me and you had only heard of the name of Gone with the Wind before, or maybe you've heard of Scarlett O'Hara, maybe you know the iconic pose that the poster for Wuthering Heights is based off of, you may not know what the film or the book is based off of or what it's even about. So Gone with the Wind 1939 was the 12th annual Academy Award winner for Best Picture and the adaptation of American writer Margaret Mitchell's book by the same title, which was first published in 1936 and which won her a Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1937. So Gone with the Wind is an American Civil War drama that focuses on the life of petulant Southern belle Scarlett O'Hara. It starts with her idyllic life on a sprawling plantation, and the film traces her survival through the tragic history of the South during the American Civil War and Reconstruction, and her tangled love affairs with Ashley Wilkes and Rhett Butler. There are a few main callbacks that Wuthering Heights does to Gone with the Wind. The first is the pose on the poster, the movie poster, which is literally a one-to-one. There's this visual callback of the tightening of the corset by the maid or the enslaved person, and the idea of a person of color or an enslaved person harming a white woman. There's a mirror of the red sky, and then there's also the matter of wardrobe. A lot of people have been criticizing this adaptation for its anachronistic wardrobe. Not only doesn't use, period accurate costumes and dresses, it instead replaces them with ones that have very similar silhouettes to ones that would have existed during the Civil War and Reconstruction era. We get the Southern belle wardrobe. Oh, and the last thing I wanted to mention in terms of similarities is that those quotation marks that she keeps talking about, those inverted commas, guess what other film also used them? Ding, ding, ding. You guessed it. Gone with the Wind. Now, I've been saying that this is, casual racism. And the reason I say that is because these callbacks to this racist film and racist story of Gone with the Wind are done so casually and so blatantly and always explained away in a very, it's still a beautiful film if you just ignore all the racism. But my question is, why are we, in the ye old year of 2026, still having nostalgia over a film that is over 80 years old? Why is Emerald Fennell wanting to call back to Gone with the Wind and sort of romanticize, that aesthetic, that film in her new work? What purpose does that serve? The success of Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind was phenomenal, and by spring 1937 had sold over 1 million copies in stores. What fascinated most readers and even serious reviewers was not only Mitchell's bold story, but her apparently scrupulous yet altogether affectionate evocation of the Old South. For Mitchell, the region and its people were indomitable, and here he quotes the book itself: "Malign fate had broken their necks, perhaps, but never their hearts. They had not whined, they had fought. And when they died spent but unquenched." Leonard J. Leff goes on to say, "The scent of magnolias lingers about this and other passages in Gone with the Wind, lending it finally a more romantic than realistic sense of history." This view of Reconstruction, not incompatible with racism, had originated in early 20th century historiography. D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, 1915, had given it eloquent cinematic expression adaptation, and in the 1930s, many people, including a number of intellectuals, still subscribed to it. Not unexpectedly, however, many American liberals and communists were outspoken in their condemnation of Mitchell's racial attitudes. As Malcolm Cowley wrote in The New Republic on September 16, 1936, the novel's presentation of Southern life was, quote, false in part, silly in part, and vicious in its general effect. Now, to David Selznick, who had purchased the rights to film the novel, Gone with the Wind was, whether accurate or not, a very valuable property. But as a producer who had grown up in the movie business, Selznick knew that certain elements of the novel would require judicious treatment when filmed by his studio. Quote, I think we have to be awfully careful, he wrote to screenwriter Sidney Howard in January 1937, that the black people come out decidedly on the right side of the ledger. Racial bookkeeping, for several reasons, was problematic. Like so many Americans, Selznick had absorbed much Reconstruction lore from The Birth of a Nation. In that same letter to Howard, for example, he distinguished between the old Klan and the Klan of our times. And by Klan, he means the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, and found only the latter culpable. So what is this essay saying? Basically, Margaret Mitchell's novel is very racist, and it romanticizes the Old South and portrays them as these noble people who have had this like tragic history. And what he goes on to explain is that, you know, despite all of these things, David Selznick still decides to adapt Gone with the Wind because everyone knew it would be a very popular, you know, adaptation. But he also knew that he had to soften the racist elements of the book in order to even make it onto the screen. And I think here people like to, you know, portray him as someone who is doing good and trying to do this adaptation as sort of like a satirical view of Scarlett O'Hara and actually more critical, and he was doing the most by, you know, making it less racist. But I think the key thing here, in which Leonard J. Leff argues in this essay, is that David Selznick, for the most part, does all these things because of a fear of backlash. Later in this essay, it also goes through the multiple different times that various organizations, including the Production Code Administration, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the Black Press, these three sort of organizations and, you know, sections of society were putting pressure on David Selznick for various reasons about this adaptation, whether it was to not adapt it at all, to make it less racist. And at later points in this essay, it points out how he was pressured to remove the N-word from the movie, and he refused to at multiple points. And people will say, you know, this is an attempt to be historically accurate, whatever else. But I don't think that your historical accuracy when it comes to racism even matters when you are literally making a film that is a pseudo-history, that is already historically inaccurate. It perpetuates what many people call the lost cause myth of the Confederacy. The lost cause myth is the argument that the goal that the Confederate States had during the Civil War was morally just, heroic, and not simply centered on maintaining slavery. Now, many people will come out fighting for this film to say that it's actually critical of the petulant Scarlet and the romanticization of the Confederacy, but that's honestly just a naive take, in my opinion, because it does romanticize the Confederacy. I did watch it after all of you yelled at me to go watch it, and we are meant to root for Scarlet, even though she's, you know, stupid and annoying and a bit of a gold digger as well. She's still meant to be a sympathetic character. We're still supposed to care for her and also feel that, you know, this is a whole tragic situation happening to her. Now, like I said, David Selznick tries to soften the more racist parts of the novel when he was adapting it for film. In the novel, there's a part where Scarlet is passing a shanty town and gets attacked by black men. But after that, her husband at that point in the novel, Frank, is upset and angry and wants his revenge. And so he gathers his KKK buddies to go to the shantytown to avenge her. And they go in the white robes or whatever, and they go to avenge her. I truly wish I was making this up, guys, but I'm not. So that is what happens in the book. She is married to someone who is in the KKK. She is already sympathetic to the KKK. The film changes the attackers to white men with a black witness. And then it vaguely mentions that Frank and his friends are on their way back from a political meeting rather than outright mentioning the KKK.
Goodbye, Sam, and thank you.
Scarlett, change your dress and go over to Miss Melly's for the evening. I've got to go to a political meeting.
A political meeting? How can you go to a political meeting after what I've been through this afternoon? The men talk about protecting our women, and then after what happened to me this afternoon, Frank has to go to a political meeting.
You've done all you could to lower the prestige of decent people, and now you've endangered the lives of our men because they've got to...
India! I don't think we better say any more, or one of us will be saying too much. What's going on around here that I don't know about?
The Yankees knew there'd be trouble tonight. They sent the cavalry out to be ready for it. Your husband and his friends are walking into a trap.
We thought it best not to tell you, Scarlett, but Ashley and Frank and the others are going to clean out those woods where you were attacked. That's what a great many of our southern gentlemen have had to do lately for our protection.
And if they're captured, they'll be hanged, Scarlett.
and it will be your fault.
And I think regardless of whatever changes that David Selznick made to the film, the intention here still doesn't matter. The film, although it softens some of these racist parts of the book, it still perpetuates racist stereotypes of Black people, including the Black rapist stereotype who wants to go after the white woman. And it also perpetuates the stereotype of the happy, contented, enslaved person. Now, a lot of people like to point to the fact that Hattie McDaniel became the first African-American person to win an Academy Award for her portrayal of the enslaved woman Mammy as some sort of validation of the film and as a sign of its progressiveness. But when it came to the actual Academy Awards, the racial segregation laws prevented her from sitting with her co-stars at the ceremony, and instead she was forced to sit in the back. So despite winning this award, she's not allowed to be on the same level as her co-stars. Now, you can't really fault Hattie McDaniel for taking a role like that in a time when there was basically no positive roles of Black people. Now, when it comes to the representation of Black people in the film, large herds of Black performers may have excused the Black characters' most egregious qualities and delighted in their humor, vividness, and humanity. Salary provided an additional incentive. Why should I complain about making $7,000 a week playing a maid? Hattie McDaniel said to her detractors. If I didn't, I'd be making $7 a week actually being one. The reality of capitalism is there. Black people didn't have many options in terms of employment. Yet prior to the shooting of Gone with the Wind, Hattie McDaniel and Oscar Pork were deeply troubled by the book's racial slurs. And according to story editor Val Luton, the publicity director did a great deal of work with them to cool their anxiety. So it's not like they were just sitting back and taking this and ignoring the racism of the film. They brought up their concern. Several other stories circulated about Blacks on the film. Supposedly, the screenplay's use of the N-word so disturbed those who auditioned for the Black character parts that the NAACP had interested itself in seeing the word deleted from the script and film. And supposedly, Black performers threatened to leave the production unless the soundstage lavatories were racially desegregated. I complained so much, Butterfly McQueen said in a 1981 interview, that Hattie McDaniel warned me that Mr. Selznick would never give me another job. Less than 3 weeks before filming ended, Selznick wrote in a June 1939 memorandum to story editor Val Luton that, quote, increasingly I regret the loss of the better Black people being able to refer to themselves as the N-word, and other uses of the N-word by one Black person talking about another. So after he did cut the use of the N-word in the film, Selznick still had doubts. In an articulate response, Luton argued against restoring the N-word, citing a deluge of protest letters that the PCA had received about it. So as you can see, Selznick was really adamant about keeping this word, despite being advised multiple times not to. Now, I think all of this is very significant because had he been left to his own devices, he would have left the word in the film. And as Leonard J. Leff argues in this article, he says, but in two very specific ways, Gone with the Wind affected American film history. Partially as a result of Selznick's vacillation on the N-word, the effect was to formalize an industry-wide prescription against the indiscriminate use of the N-word. The enormous success of the film also worked to the Black community's advantage. Since Gone with the Wind was the film to end all Southern plantation films, it virtually halted the production of regressive movies within the genre. So as this article kind of argues, these two things, the codification of not using the N-word and also broadening the range of Black actor roles in Hollywood, those two things are byproducts of this film. They weren't intentional effects of this film. Selznick did not create this film with any of those intentions. He wanted to keep the N-word in the film. So you can see why I might find it stupid that people defend this film as some grand example of racial tolerance when literally it's just another racist film that accidentally helped change some attitudes, but it still reinforced racial stereotypes. And I think calling back to such a film is such a casual racist sort of insidious form of racism because it's the type of racism that just sort of sits in the background. It's all this attempt to say you're not racist in name, but in action you still will be. In truth, her callbacks to Gone with the Wind are just as casual as the way some white people will still read the Gone with the Wind book and watch the movie as their comfort media, while casually ignoring the racism. Now, people also say that we can't just ignore Gone with the Wind and like excise it from our memory like the film excises the mention of the KKK. And while I agree we can't pretend it didn't happen, if we want to learn about history, go fucking read a history book or pull up a article or a nonfiction source. You do not need a fictional movie that romanticizes the Old South to teach you about the Civil War era and how, you know, black people were treated back then. Like, if you want to learn those things, go read a fucking history book. And don't come to me about how we need to prop up this racist fucking film at some attempt of history keeping when it's already telling a wrong history. Okay, we are on to the final section of this video. I'm so sorry this is so long, but all of this I think is a sign of the times. And the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of hyper-individualism and this fear of sitting with discomfort. So I did have this critique of Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein as well, which was that the move to soften the monster in that film and allow him to forgive Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, at the end was by far the worst decision the film could have made, in my opinion. And similarly, Emerald Fennell's move to soften Heathcliff's character, ironically also played by Jacob Elordi, and make his character more focused on a romantic vengeance rather than any sort of societal, racial, class, property vengeance, was also its worst move. Now, let me be clear here before you come for me that I think Del Toro's Frankenstein is still a spiritual adaptation of the book and has nowhere near the hollowness of Fennell's Wuthering Heights as a failure of an adaptation. However, I do think that film and this film both point to a broader issue. I think it's curious that both films are constantly defended as being the director's particular personal reflection onto the story rather than any sort of intellectual, stylistic, artistic take on the source material. Rather than saying, I want to artistically focus on XYZ theme of the book or pull this or that thread from the source, instead we get Del Toro saying he wants to tell a father-son story, a rather autobiographical take that includes forgiveness for personal freedom. When we know that Frankenstein the novel is not really so much about Frankenstein and the monster, but what this situation has to say about broader, society, about the hubris of man, not just this man, but men. And I think it's key to note that at the end of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the monster does not forgive Frankenstein. The monster actually stays quite bitter to the very end. And there's a reason for that, because it's meant to make you contend with this feeling of discomfort, with this feeling of guilt over what society has brought upon this innocent creature. With Emerald Fennell, we have her going on in interviews about how this is what her 14-year-old self imagined the book to be. And she decided to use that imaginative fan fiction version that her 14-year-old self had of the book to create this adaptation, which is again a very individual take rather than the very broad social commentary that Wuthering Heights has. Our creator I really like said this in a recent video about the Gothic.
We adapt Gothic literature and only focus on the aesthetics. We miss the point of the text entirely. Darkness is not decorative, it is diagnostic.
I love this idea of it's meant to be diagnostic. It's meant to be a commentary on society and show us the ailments of society. I mean, both of these works are, adaptations of Gothic novels. And both of their takes are a refusal to, one, sit with the discomfort of the original works, but also two, to contend with the more pressing themes of the novel and how they reflect on our current day. Both books are incredible works of literature that also remain relevant and debated to this day. I mean, this video, case in point, because of the insight into and the commentary that they have on our society. And not just society from 1818 when Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published, or even 1847 from Emily Bronte's time. It's a continued commentary on our society even today, even in 2026. I mean, there is so much to be said about the hubris of man and the idea of a womanless creation in Frankenstein that has so much insight into what we're facing today with AI. And then, with Wuthering Heights, we have the views towards racialized others and how we are still perpetuating racist norms. And so I think altogether, these hyper-individualistic takes are a sign of how we are refusing to contend with the larger themes of these novels and really sit with that discomfort and sit with the fact that we are guilty in some part as a society. I want to read to you a quote from Volume 2, Chapter 10, that Nelly says to Kathy Jr., who is sort of making fun of the way that Hareton is sort of uneducated. Nelly says, "I shall not not scold, but I don't like your conduct here. If you had remembered that Hareton was your cousin as much as Master Heathcliff, you would have felt how improper it was to behave in that way. At least it was praiseworthy ambition for him, Hareton, to desire to be as accomplished as Linton. And probably he did not learn merely to show off. You had made him ashamed of his ignorance before, I have no doubt. And he wished to remedy it and please you. To sneer at his imperfect attempt was very bad breeding. Had you been brought up in his circumstances, would you be less rude? He was as quick and as intelligent a child as ever you were, and I'm hurt that he should be despised now because that base Heathcliff has treated him so unjustly. So this quote is not only a commentary on how, Heathcliff was treated so poorly, and so that's how he became who he was, and that same violence is being done to Hareton, but it's also a commentary on how it's horrible that Cathy Jr. is making fun of Hareton wanting to learn and his attempts to learn. And that's something that's constant to this day. We make fun of people who want to learn, and it deters them from wanting to learn more. And I thought it was interesting with this film coming out, so many people were picking up Wuthering Heights, which I'm so excited about. And actually, I think the biggest benefit of this film is more people picking up the book than, they ever would have before, and people revisiting the book, me revisiting the book because of this film. There was this sort of trend online of people bemoaning how hard it was to read this book. It's a difficult book, I agree. It is, a Victorian novel. It is written at a reading level that is quite high for a lot of people, which is actually just a sign of our times, because that is actually a high school level reading level. They teach this book in high schools in Canada. They teach it in the UK. I don't know if they teach it in the US. So in theory, many of us should be able to understand it. And it's okay that people don't. But I think it was interesting seeing these videos of people being like, ha ha ha, I'm reading Wuthering Heights, I don't understand a thing, and now I'm giving up. Or, who cares? I'll just watch the movie. And I think it's interesting that people have that reaction rather than wanting to learn to parse the meaning of this thing. I know it's difficult, but I think very often we don't want to deal with the difficulty of understanding something. Anyways, getting people who typically do not read to read is an admirable feat. And even I, in making this video and in re-engaging with the text, have been intellectually stimulated in a way I haven't been in a long time, since my university days, because I was reading all of these, articles and things like that. But it's very obvious from the portrayal of the story in this film that Emerald Fennell did not want to engage with it on a more intellectual level. It was a visually stunning movie, like many people have been saying, but it lacked any kind of depth. It was so hollow, and it was stripped of so much of the meaning that the original text has. And I think that's a bit of the sign of the times, because we are so used to short form content and social media and, not deeply engaging with things and just surface level engaging with things, that we see a film like this and we're just like, I guess it was all right, and then move on with our lives without interrogating that further. And I'm so glad that so many of the critical reviews were actually honest and critical of this film. I thought I was going crazy after I first watched it, because I saw so many people, mostly white reviewers, saying that they loved it. And I was like, okay, well, what did you love? And they were like, well, it was pretty, and I like Jacob Elordi, and Margo Robbie's pretty. And I'm like, okay, aside from that though, what did you love? What did you love? And I think the fact that we're not willing to question that is scary. However, those of you who are watching this video, I hope that you gained something out of this, that you learned something new, that you learned more about the book, that, if you haven't picked it up, you are thinking of picking it up. And if you did watch the film and hated it just like I did, hopefully you felt vindicated by this video. And if you want to support me and my channel, please go check out my bindery community. You can sign up as a free follower or a paid member to support me and my channel. And as always, thank you so much to my bindery members for supporting me and my channel. Let me know what you thought of this video. Let me know your thoughts on the entire topic. Feel free to comment on any of the things that I brought up in this video, and if you have further thoughts, I'm sure many of you will fight with me in the comments, and that's okay. We can acknowledge that this is my opinion backed up with a lot of evidence, but it's still my opinion. So I will see you all in my next video, and please remember that this story ain't over. Bye.